Hello, and welcome to Words That Burn. This week, I have an interview with a very special guest, English poet Jamie McKendrick. Jamie McKendrick is one of Britain's leading poets and the foremost translator of Italian poetry into English in the UK. He joins me this week to discuss his new collection, Drypoint, from Faber and Faber. It's a series of verse that explores memory, mortality, and everything beyond. Hi Jamie, how's it going?
Hi there, Ben. Thanks for asking me here. Yeah, it's my 8th collection of poems, as in 8 volumes of poems. And I gave it the title Drypoint. There's a poem in the collection, as often is the case, called Drypoint. Just a word about what Drypoint is. Some people will know it. It's an etching technique where you directly work on metal or with a diamond point, and it brings up a burr in the metal surface. So it's a less complicated form of etching than using acid or a ground. I've always been interested in etching. I had luckily the use of an etching studio when I was about 20 in an art college. And so I didn't actually use Drypoint then, but I just used normal etching techniques. But I think some of my work, because I have a sideline in doing painting and drawing, quite a lot of my work has, particularly of late, and I also write on art, have written on art anyway. So I'm interested in the parallels. In this book, it's not really to the forefront of the collection, but there is a poem about an insect engraving, and there's a few other references here and there to the visual arts. And I had a book way back called Inkstone, which had a similar kind of dealing with the materiality of artwork. Inkstone being a Japanese or Chinese stone which you grind an ink stick on to get the ink, which then makes the painting. That's a little bit just as a background, but I think it is about, there's a difference between the materiality of working with a medium like etching, which is physical, and a poem, even if there's an implied analogy, it's an imperfect analogy.
When we talk about that, because as you said, there's a little bit of reference to the visual arts here. It's even peppered into some of the poems like Saint Jerome in Self-Isolation, where he makes a reference, or your speaker as Saint Jerome makes a reference to himself as posing for painters because he's such a renowned subject.
Yeah. In a very irritable form. Actually, and I think there is something to do with that poem, because St. Jerome translates the Bible into Latin. And I think translation is another theme that figures throughout. And I suppose you could think of the visual world as a translation of the word as well. And the last section of the book was actually first published as a collection of poems, each of which had an illustration which I did, called The Years. So that's the last section. So there is, if you like, an ongoing complication with the visual and the verbal. Yeah.
You have a real talent for evoking some very specific visual ideas through language. I think it comes through quite a bit in this collection. I suppose this collection is a testament to memory, mortality, and the passage of time a lot of the time, I found when I was reading through it. So do you think there's a significance in choosing Drypoint as the title for it? Do you think in particular there's a connection there for you related to those things and the idea of memory and marking the passage of time, or is it just one of your favorite poems that you wrote for this collection?
It's not necessarily one of my favorite poems, and it's probably a problematic title. Certainly it seems to divide people, those who didn't like it. A very good Northern Irish poet said it was terrible, and he said dry, that's a bad word. And surely the point of poetry, there's no point to it. Much as I appreciated it, I stuck with the title. Yeah, I think it's more to signal that kind of interrelation between the title, between the technique and the writing. I think you're right. There are elements that have to do with memory and mortality. You get to
I mean, I don't think it's fair to critique someone's choice of title for their poetry collection, but everyone's a critic anyway, Jamie. I wouldn't worry about it too much. I thought it was quite good. I thought it fits quite well with the themes of the collection.
Yeah, the only difficulty is that maybe it is a very particular technique, and so it might not resonate for people. But you can't cater for anyone.
That's a good segue when we talk about catering for an audience in places in this collection in particular, because there are a few poems that specifically deal with the writing of poetry and kind of the craft behind choosing your subject or finding something that resonates with you. One of the poems that I really felt jumped out at me in that regard was Neither Fish Nor Fowl.
That's pretty head on in the relation. Just as another such poem, but from way back, Dante's friend Guido Cavalcanti wrote one of the first, what you might call metapoetic poems, which is the actual speaker of the poem are the physical equipment of writing, as in scissors and quills. So they're actually speaking on behalf of the poet to try and persuade his beloved to have pity on him. But the poem Neither Fish Nor Fowl, I could read that.
That would be amazing.
An idea, if I can find it. Wait a minute. So, neither fish nor fowl. Sometimes mending a poem can feel like... Sorry, I couldn't read it because of the light. Sometimes mending a poem can feel like freeing a large fish from a coil of plastic netting, working away with only a pocket knife, while the fish thrashes about, suspicious that every saving cut will end its life. But then the fish turns out to be a turtle, with gashes on its verdant mottled limbs. You might expect a modicum of gratitude, though you'd be wrong. No sooner disentangled, the brute turns tail and heads off out to sea. But never fear, someone with a turtle spear stands ready to gaff the ingrate. Will you look, he says, at its clumsy flippers that aren't at all like fins or feathers. The least we can do is put the poor thing out of its misery.
So I absolutely love this poem. I wonder if you would take a few minutes and just explain what the significance is of it for yourself and how it came to you, because it has quite a turn there from simple fishing to almost the culling of the turtle. And I'm just curious as to the significance there.
Yeah, I'd have to say that the unpleasant in that sense is not me necessarily, but more likely an unsympathetic critic who sees, or reader who sees no point in it's not a fish nor a fowl. It doesn't have fins or feathers, which is a kind of form of criticism but the poem isn't taking sides with the poet against the critic. It's not presuming, because the poem might start off going in one direction and then turn into something else altogether, an injured turtle instead of a fish. But yeah, of course, the idea of fishing, and it is something that crops up later in the case of a heron, the idea of fishing does have an analogy for, I never fish, or I've once in my life fished, but I don't think, I think that the process is you're waiting on the arrival of something. In this case, you're trying to save something. So maybe if the analogy holds, you're saving a bad version and trying to salvage something from it. Then it turns into something else, and then it gets killed by someone else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Makes perfect.
That's how I would see it. But...
So a question I often ask of poets when they come on and do interviews with me is, how do you collect your poetry? Because you spoke a little bit there about salvaging some of the stuff. Are you a notebook man? Is it kept in the archive on your phone? How do collections come together for you overall?
Right. I missed a part of the question, but I think I've understood it. don't use a computer or a phone. I'm still in an older mode of, I don't like Cavalcanti use a quill, but I do use a biro, and
Okay.
usually some old envelope, the back of an old envelope, often a tax envelope which I haven't opened. So it's written on nasty brown paper so I don't get any stage fright, in microscript so no one else can read it. And then it goes through quite, I mean, unless I'm dead lucky, and that's quite rare, it goes through a lot of stages before it's before it's printed up. It used to be in the happy old days a typewriter, but it's easier to make the small adjustments on the screen. So I have moved onto the screen. Is that the answer? I mean, is that an answer to what you asked?
Absolutely.
I do have notebooks, but they're very intermittent. But they're very useful because sometimes I fail to write a poem, and then I can go back and suddenly see how it can be at least improved. Some people just don't have that bother. They just get it right first time. I think they're rare and wonderful creatures who somehow it all goes on in their head and they don't have to scribble on a piece of paper. But I think people find their own way of working. Mine is quite laborious. But I quite like the idea of writing. I think Ted Hughes says somewhere people should use the pen. I'm not being prescriptive, but I think there is some link with the hand and the body, which you have where it's tapping on a keyboard, at least for me, doesn't have it. And of course, you're using your hands. But
It's a perfect answer to that question, Jamie. That was exactly what I was looking for in that particular case. I mean, speak again a little bit in the collection at different times about the process of poetry, and you said yourself there that it was a little your own process is a little laborious when it comes to refining a poem down to a finished product that you'd like to put out there. And one of the things that I've noticed is, you mentioned a little bit earlier as well, the first meta poetry or intertextuality in certain poems were friends of Dante and things like that. For you, intertextuality seems to be a common kind of tool that you use to bring out the best in your poetry. I was wondering, when it comes to that kind of intertextuality, when it comes to mentioning other poets or poems like a purloined line from, I cannot remember the name of the gentleman. I'm very sorry.
Yeah,
yeah, Paul Bowles.
Yeah,
Paul Bowles.
Purloined from Paul Bowles. Yeah, I think it's probably a common thought, but a poem enters into dialogue with not just the living but the dead. So some of the translations are from the very long dead. Cavalcanti, Petrarch, Dante. It might seem a bit presumptuous to scatter a book of your poems with the immortal dead, but nevertheless, those voices that you hear have made an impact on you, and of course you could hide them, or it could be a discrete reference, but sometimes and in this book, and maybe in my last book, Anomaly, I quite like to foreground that sense of other voices. Maybe there's quite an excess or an abundance of translations here, but that's contemporaries as well. I mean, there are two contemporaries I translate from Italian poet Antonella Aneda and Valerio Magrelli, who I've done books of, but I've just put one each for them there because they're voices that have entered into my acoustic range, and I've had to find a voice for their poems. So there's that. But then, okay, taking the Paul Bowles, it's just a line that struck me when I was reading his novel, Let It Fall Down. Or is it Let It All Fall Down? Anyway, he's purloined that title from Macbeth. It's when the murderer says to Banquo about the rain, let it fall down. So he's been a bit intertextual even with his title. Anyway, it's a line that it was rather fun to be lost like that, like this, which I just repeat as a kind of refrain, but distorting it and moving it across the poem. It's a kind of slightly dreamlike lockdown poem, I guess. It's just people wandering in a landscape which is depopulated and feeling lost, but pretending it's fun. Yeah, so then another poem, just to give a different type of example, which you mentioned before, is Close Enough, which is a poem dedicated to Bernard O'Donoghue, the Irish poet who lives in Oxford. But that was actually just occasioned by a telephone call, which again relates to Dante, because both of us were translating a canto from the Commedia, and he asked quite reasonably, does Earth take a capital letter? And there is an answer to that. But the poem is just then meditates on what it means to give a capital letter to the Earth, and in the kind of slightly difficult context of the Dante. But this is sounding really scholarly, but in fact, a lot of voices that you get in poems are not necessarily literary, as is that in that case, but they're voices of people on the bus or whatever, just the voices around you. And in other words, what I'm saying is that intertextuality is of the nature of a poem, but of all art forms. I mean, just looking at a contemporary American painting, and it made me think of an early Manet picture, and sure enough, that happened to be true. I checked with somebody who knows her. This is a fact that the arts continually enter into that kind of just dialogue with the past. I mean, there is a counter-argument. You want something new. You don't want to be just reiterating what's said. It's got to be something that you're doing with that.
I think interpretation at that level is almost essential in poetry today. I always fall back on that phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. It's all been there before, and you can either copy secretly, or you can be an honest poet and wear your influences on your sleeves. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. I mean, I have no difficulty in declaring it, but then sometimes I've put in, like in my last book, there was a reference to a very famous Ezra Pound poem about faces in the metro, and a question came back in the process of it being published, did I need to signal? And I said, no, it's too famous. But yeah, then you get hit for plagiarism, I guess. But I mean, you just got to make a call whether it's so current or not. And actually, it can look a bit patronizing if you sort of footnote every obvious reference. I think if it's slightly obscure to me, I think it's worth signalling.
It's a good rule of thumb to follow, I suppose, when you're in the habit of picking up little bits and pieces from famous works or established works and things like that. It's funny, when you were talking there, you spoke a little bit about sometimes it's a voice of the immortal dead, sometimes it's a chat on a bus as you go, and it put me in mind of one of the poems in the collection that comes quite early on, but it's Nugget, and you draw a parallel between, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong here, Jamie, and you're welcome to correct me at any point, but you draw a parallel between the work of Aussie gold hunters on a reality TV program and kind of finding poetry or little bits of poetry. And it's funny the way you spoke about borrowing a little bit here, borrowing a little bit there, certain lines cascading into a bigger poem, conversations with fellow translators and things like that. But do you feel that Nugget as a poem is about that kind of experience of mining for little nuggets of poetry, as it were, or is there something else going on in that poem?
That sounds like a good reading. Perhaps I should read the poem so it makes sense, even if I don't. It's dedicated to Michael Hoffman, who's a very distinguished poet and translator, contemporary. There's a reason for that I won't go into, but it's called Nugget. And it belongs to a sort of mini sequence in the book which have to do with the gifts of the Magi. So it's Nugget, as in gold, frankincense, myrrh, and Balthazar, one of the Magi. Okay, so Nugget. And the reference to Marquez is Garcia Marquez, the Colombian writer who's a magical realist. He happened to just dislike gold intensely, as do I, and wouldn't have it about him. But anyway, but it's a symbol, gold, I suppose, which, whatever you feel about it, however blood-stained it is, has a kind of poetic and artistic symbolism. Nugget. The magician Marquez had a dread of gold and wouldn't wear it. But here I am sitting through Aussie gold diggers that's enjoyed a lockdown boom, perhaps for its promise of hidden treasure, or because these pale-skinned mates have put their lives on hold to scour a red desert under a cruel sun, with a stick that hums, then gives a wail of hope for what? A bug-sized nugget or a rusted can. Just yards away in the unprospected zone, if only they'd swerved instead of keeping straight, lies a buried glory which they'll never find. They could almost be poets, the way they trudge cussedly on, quite oblivious to all the dross and mess they leave behind.
Yeah. So again, I really enjoy the way that you seem again to have a real knack or talent for layering two things that you would almost never put together, two images that you would never coincide, writing poetry and mining for gold. But you strike a wonderful balance between both things. But one of the things that jumps out at me when I hear that poem and when I read that poem was, what kind of dross and mess do you think poets leave behind them in general?
Yeah, in my case, a lot of mess. But yeah, maybe there's a hope that the poem itself might mitigate some of that mess and dross. It might be quarried out of dross, but something possibly gleaming arrives out of it. And also, I mean, because it's set in the lockdown, maybe other people like me were watching crap reality TV. I certainly was. But I got rather fascinated by the Australians out in this red desert, desperately looking for tiny bits of gold. And then, leaving just a mess behind them with the earth movers and various mechanical bits of digging equipment. I suppose, it's not just poets that leave a mess. I think it's part of the human condition. We all leave a mess. But, so there is a kind of ecological concern there. But I think it's not, as I say, not just poets, but there is something about, like, the commonality between the gold diggers and the poets, I guess, is it's a quest really after something, whether it's a pearl of great price or a poem. It's something, it may be dogged by failure, and I think Trudge Cussedly On is about that fact that you may be just missing it by an inch or a mile. Had you taken another turn, you might have found it. So it sounds pessimistic, but it's meant to be a wee bit light-hearted.
It comes across with a real sense of humor when you read it, and I'm glad to hear that I didn't miss the mark myself when I was reading it and came across that. It's funny that you talk a little bit about a quest there, because I always associate quests with myth and fable and folklore, and it seems to be a real focus of yours to bring some element of mythology, especially classical mythology, into your work. And I was just wondering, because there are quite a few poems that center, if not entirely around mythology, they have figures from myth appear, or you have some translations from famous mythological texts like the Aeneid and things like that. I was wondering where your love of mythology has come from, and how does it factor into your poetry as you're writing?
Yeah, I suppose mythology has a kind of wide span. I think there's a bit of religion being referred to, maybe in quite a secular tone, but I mean, the gifts of the Magi, for example. I remember somebody when I was in my 20s saying to me, he must have been quoting religion is man's attempt to get in touch with the weather, which certainly is witty but reductive, and, as it does now. And yet, it's not without some truth. I mean, if you live in the vicinity of a volcano, as I did for quite some years, there's an awesome power there that you might feel, I don't know, inclined to personify or appease. There's one poem called Report to the Anthropological Society, which is set on the flanks of Vesuvius. And so the big exterminator is there with a huge population in its vicinity. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose the volcanic is associated with Hephaestus. And, yeah, I guess you can't, I've done the odd bit of translation from the classics, but I don't really have much classical learning behind that. But in this case, and in another poem from way back I did about Palinurus, who is somebody, the helmsman in the Aeneid, who gets washed up on the shore of Italy and gets stabbed by the inhabitants. Polydorus in the poem Myrrh here is killed, not quite in the same way. He's a treacherous king of Thrace that gets rid of him, Polydorus being the youngest son of Priam. Yeah, I haven't really answered your question.
That's okay.
I guess mythology is about telling stories, and the poems are bound to have some overlap with mythology, whether they're utilising ancient mythology or creating their own, or turning the old into something different.
I think you've probably, again, found a really nice easing into another major theme that I picked up from Drypoint, which was you do contrast the modern and contemporary with the ancient quite a bit in what you're doing. And not only the ancient, but you do have the history versus the present quite often in what you're writing about. And we spoke a little bit before we started to record here about how Liverpool, where you are from, is very tied to this collection. I wondered if you just expand on that a little bit for me and talk about how the more recent history of Liverpool and modern Liverpool kind of feature within Drypoint.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I've dealt with, or I've touched on Liverpool throughout the 7 or 8 books, but in this particular case, there's one poem called War, which is looking back to my mother's experience of being actually one of the first incendiary bombs dropped on her house. And luckily, my uncle, who tried to get it out of the bath, was injured, but not fatally. So it's a little bit about that. In the context, it was written or rewritten whilst the Russian invasion was taking place in Mariupol. So there is a connection that these historical analogies, I think, have to be treated with care. I hope I haven't overstepped the mark on that. But the other thing is, I guess Liverpool is a city of immigrants. We're all a couple of generations or more back from elsewhere. I mean, there have been, for unhappy reasons of history, there have been immigrant communities in Liverpool for centuries. Obviously, the Irish connection is very big. We used to proudly call it the capital of Ireland. Then Welsh, Scottish, both sides of my family, Scots and Irish. But then a Jewish community has been there for ages, a Greek community. Cavafy spent some time, the Alexandrian Greek poet. There's a Greek Orthodox church. There's West Africans is the earliest Chinatown in Liverpool is there. The West African and the Somalian waves of immigration, and obviously the black community from the unhappy connection with the slave trade has been there for longer than in London. It's not always a happy history, far from it. There have been instances of dire racism, and we've seen another recrudescence of that in the last couple of weeks. But being a place full of immigrants, it's also got a history of kind of different peoples living quite happily alongside one another. So, yeah, I think that aspect, maybe it's more to the fore in other collections I've done, but it is a kind of returning topic. Liverpool itself as a city, that perhaps doesn't explain much about how it figures in this book, but
I think it explains it quite well. You speak about immigrant communities there and sometimes the very unhappy history that comes with a city having a multicultural population. One of the really strong senses I got from this collection was an examination of borders that we've constructed as people. And I think the idea of the man-made construct of a border paling in comparison to the natural order of the world, or the kind of nature's order to things, was a huge thing that jumped out to me quite a bit in this collection. You seem to, and again, you are welcome to correct me, but you seem to take an issue with the kind of notions we've given ourselves with regards to ownership of certain things or rights to other things throughout the collection.
I think that's true. I mean, just the most obvious example of it is a poem, Muntjac, which I could read, which does deal with the idea of borders. I mean, borders are going to stay with us, like the rich. They're going to cause grief forever. I mean, you have in Ireland, it's been about 103 years since a border was drawn across the island, and it's been a cause of continuing grief. And even now, for commercial reasons, it's become very problematic with the UK's extraction of itself from the EU. I think perhaps my last collection was more in the foreground, that event of Brexit. But anyway, yeah, in the last few days, this was written before, obviously, but the last few weeks we've had more of that kind of sense of an unleashing of bigotry in the country. Anyway, this is Muntjac. Sturdy, low-slung, skittish, horned, betusked, the immigrant Muntjac once more breaks into the garden for his annual browse of weeds and whatnot. Bienvenido de vuelta, welcome back, we say in our respective tongues. Mi casa es tu casa. The garden too is yours as much as ours. Perhaps more yours, the way you stroll about and graze on plants we haven't even learned the names of in either tongue. Our ownership's in doubt, so we're disinclined to trespass on this ground you've reached by stealth, through fields and fences, by routes we'd never clocked, according to a scent map that skeins and threads and loops across the borders of our ruled enclosures. So yeah, in a way, the Muntjac has more right to be in our garden than we do. So I'm, for the moment, ceding possession to the Muntjac, particularly because it's ridding us of weeds, which I can't be bothered to cut.
I think what I like most about that poem is that it challenges even the misconception of ownership through language. You say that the Muntjac has knowledge of names that we don't know in either language. We don't have, but there is a kind of a true line there that can be perceived by the Muntjac that we can't. And I think it challenges that notion that we have any conception of what people understand, don't understand, lay ownership to, don't lay ownership to. I just thought it was a lovely poem that gently stirs you to contemplate or reconsider issues through a different lens. It's never...
There's a poem by Hardy called An August Midnight, which talks about various insects that arrive and walk across his page, and it ends up with, they know Earth's secrets that know not we, or know not I, I'm sorry. So the knowledge of Earth's secrets is there enshrined in Hardy's great poem. And I've always liked that. It's a sense that we have a kind of curatorship of the Earth, not an ownership of it. And we don't know as much as we maybe think we do.
I think that crops up quite a bit in your work. The poem that I was most taken with, and I just thought it was it was something that could only be a poem. I'm always taken with poetry that could. Sometimes you have novels and they could be films, and sometimes you have films and they could be video games or whatever. There's a translatability to certain media. They could be carried across with little or no loss. But I am particularly taken with poems that could only be poems. One of the poems in this collection that I think does that very well is Alternative Anatomy, where you talk about a moth and their perseverance through the world. And the only reason I bring it up is because I think it resonates quite well with that Hardy quote that you had about they know the secrets of the world that we don't. You almost create a microcosm of existence for a moth, and it made me pause for a second and think about the real trials and tribulations that a tiny creature like that must go through in the world. And I suppose I don't have a question there, Jamie, but I just wanted to say, definitely one of my favourite poems from this collection. I was very taken with it.
I think the poem actually has a secret, I'm sorry, I'm getting more literary, but it has a secret kinship with a poem by Frost called Design. And in the end of it, it's basically the poem has got this white heel flower with a white moth that comes unaware of the fact that there's waiting in ambush is a white spider. So it's the kind of deathly whiteness throughout the poem. And he asks this rhetorical question at the end. He asks, what is causing this? What but design of darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small? So it's a kind of slightly demonic Darwinism, is that in Frost's case, the answer supplied is that if, like the argument for the creator, if the designer of the universe has designed such a horrible concoction of elements, it's not a very nice designer. So in my case, I think I'd like to see that the moth is evolving its own strategies for avoiding the ambush, in this case of the bats. So it's not quite as gloomy, though I love Frost's poem. It's finding modes of escape or evasion on the part of the moth. In other words, if you want to look at it in evolutionary terms, there's armaments built up on one side and defense mechanisms on the other. I think the poem is slightly more in sympathy with the defense mechanisms, but the two exist together.
It's a beautiful way. I mean, nature is everywhere in your poetry by the looks of things, Jamie, and you do a wonderful job of evoking it in both in the quiet dignity that it often has that we overlook, I suppose, as humans, and then also in the sort of nature red and tooth and claw vibe that sometimes comes with that kind of poetry. You capture both sides of it quite well. I'm quite conscious of time here, Jamie, and I suppose we should probably draw to a close, unfortunately. As much as I'm enjoying the conversation, I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I wanted to ask you one final question to close us out. If you were to give, and I don't want you to sum up your entire collection, but if you were to give one message of the many messages within your collection as a takeaway to readers, and I know you don't like to be prescriptive in the reading, but what is something you would hope people might take away from this collection?
I think I really struggle to answer that.
That's okay.
It intrudes on the reader's role, which, despite my little attack on the critic in neither fish nor fowl, once you've written the poems, you leave it up to other people to either gaff them with a turtle spear or enjoy them. I think it's, in that sense, the medium is the message. I'm sorry, it's a cliche, but the poems, once they're published in a book, they have a kind of autonomy which just has to be free of the intrusions of the author. And in fact, the author isn't always the best person to say, because the word is refracted through other people's, those who are good enough to read it. It's their their consciousness that's affected or not by the poem. So sorry if that sounds a bit secretive. It's a genuine feeling that it's. I mean, I think I could sort of question a reading of a poem and suggest a counter reading, but I am just at this point a reader, no longer an authority as author. You know?
I don't think that's a secretive answer at all. I think that's a perfect answer to the question, to be honest. Jamie McKendrick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It has been an absolute pleasure to interview you, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, Ben, thanks a lot. It's been very nice to be there. Thanks and bye.
That was my interview with poet Jamie McKendrick. You can find his collection Drypoint wherever poetry is sold. If you enjoyed this interview, please consider giving me a review wherever you listen. It really does help me to get the podcast out to more people each week.